Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sharon Bonney. I'm the Executive Director for the Coalition on Adult Basic Education, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today to our webinar on making connections between research and practice. We have some excellent presenters here, leaders really in the field, who will be talking about this. I'll turn it over to them in just one moment. Before I do, I wanted to also mention that we have with us today our leading sponsor, Michael Ormsby, with Essential Education. And Michael Ormsby has done so much in the field for adult education and also for our COAID members. You may or may not be aware we have a new Research to Practice initiative, and that's underwritten by funding from Essential Education, and it's been very popular. We have over 4,000 to 5,000 unique visitors monthly for our Research to Practice initiative. As well, Michael has supported our resource repository, which also is very popular, over 13,000 users on that site. So I just want to say thank you to Michael for your financial support. And then without further ado, I would like to turn this over to our two presenters, who are Margaret Patterson and Alisa Belzer. Thank you for being with us today.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alisa Belzer, and I'm here with my colleague, Margaret Patterson. Margaret's going to share her screen so that you will be able to see our presentation. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. Number one, there will be an opportunity at the end of our session to ask questions. If you'd like to post any questions during the session, we ask that you use the chat box rather than the Q&A. The chat box will allow everybody to see the questions, and then you'll know if your question has already been asked. If you use the Q&A, you won't be able to see that. We will get to that at the end, so don't feel ignored if we aren't paying attention to it during the course of our presentation. I'll also say that after Margaret and I say hello, we're going to close off our video view so that you'll just be watching the, Margaret's getting her PowerPoint together. So that you'll just be watching our PowerPoint presentation. I know for myself, I'm a little nervous that if I have the video and the audio going, my broadband might not be sustained. And Margaret, do you want me to put my version of the slides up?
Can you not see it?
No.
I thought I had it up. Okay, let me try it again. Sorry, everybody.
We're looking at the text. So we're going to turn off our video in a second, but you'll hear us speaking throughout. So as soon as the video comes up, we'll get started, but while we're waiting for that, I'll just tell you that our first few slides are actually poll questions that we'd like you to participate in. So we're very delighted to have so many participants here with us, and we'd like to know a little bit about your own experiences with using research in your practice as a way to help kind of guide our conversation as we go. So do you want me to do it, Margaret? I can put mine up.
Alisa, would you like me to launch the poll now? Wait.
Yes, now we've got it. We've got it.
You can see it? Okay. Sorry about that, everyone.
You can just put it in slideshow version.
Got it?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Okay, so yes, Sharon, if you would launch the poll, we have 4 questions we'd like you to answer, so you don't get to just listen for this session. You'll see the polls. You should be able to see it on your screen now, and as soon as results start coming in, you'll start to see those results. So question 1, what sources do you use to find research articles? Please go ahead and vote. I'm going to stop my video. Bye, everybody, but I'm here. And you can scroll down to see all 4 questions. So please go ahead and vote. Sharon, there's a question from someone about signing in.
They would need to sign in on the link that was provided on the website.
They must be signed in if they're able to ask that question.
Right.
So I'm not really sure. Whoever asked that question, can you be more specific what you need help with? And are we starting to see results come in on the poll?
We are. We have 97 out of 142 have voted so far. So are you ready for the results? And I can hit.
Let's take another minute or two, give a few more people a chance. Okay, someone's saying that the system won't allow her to submit her results.
Yeah, I don't know what to say, Alisa. We see 100 of the 144 have voted.
Okay, so to the person who can't submit results, a couple of people are saying they can't submit their results. So we're getting a lot of people with results. I'm not exactly sure what to tell those people who can't. So let's do about another 10-15 seconds and then we'll post the results. This is live. We don't know. It says they may not be scrolling all the way down through the question. So make sure you go all the way down to the bottom and look and see if you can see submit. Live webinar, you never know what's going to happen. Sharon, I think you should go ahead and post the results. Sorry if you didn't get to share your results, but probably with a group this big, you'll see your own experience represented in the results. Okay, so here's what we see. What sources do you use to find research articles? Most people are using a general search engine like Google. And next is Eric, and then about the same for Google Scholar and college or university database. So moving on, and we will talk about all of these issues as we go through the webinar. How often do you turn to research? Only about 50% of you say regularly. When you add in 40% sometimes, there's very few of you who rarely or never, but only about half of you do it regularly. How understandable do you find the research that you read? Most of you said somewhat. Very few of you said, well, about a third of you said it's very understandable, which is not a huge number. Very few of you said it's not understandable at all. And fourth, how useful do you consider most of the research? Most of you said somewhat useful, and the next most popular answer, but only a quarter of you said very useful. So the point of our doing this poll is really that we're seeing that there is a need to talk about using research in practice, that accessing research is fairly good, but a lot of people are either not using research very much or not finding it terribly helpful or comprehensible. So our session today is really, I'm going to close it, is really designed to help address some of these issues and also to start a conversation, or I should say to continue a conversation that's been going on over a year now about building better connections between research and practice. We'll speak more about that in a moment. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Margaret, who will speak more specifically about the purpose of the webinar.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here this afternoon. I appreciate everybody coming out. Welcome to the webinar. And again, we want to thank COABE and Michael for their support of our activity today. We'd like to start, let me go ahead and see if I can start my video so you can see me. Good afternoon. And I'll go ahead and take myself back off, but I just wanted you to be able to put a name with a face. We would like to go ahead and start with our purpose for today. And our purpose for this webinar is for Alisa and I to follow up a little bit on a forum article that I wrote for the Journal of Research and Practice for Adult Literacy, Secondary, and Basic Education, affectionately known as the COABE Journal. And this was in the winter 2016 issue, which you can find available to you on the COABE website if you're interested in that. The forum article was called Research to Practice Connections, and it starts on page 30 of that issue if you're interested in looking at it. So our first purpose today is to promote practitioner use of research. So we will talk about 3 topics as we go along. The first topic is locating research, second, evaluating research, and then using research. And we're keeping an overarching purpose in mind of engaging more practitioners in a conversation about strengthening connections between research and practice. These conversations were begun at a meeting of the American Educational Research Association last April, and also at COABE in Dallas last spring. And we're going to continue them through a special session at the upcoming COABE conference in Orlando in April. So we're excited to be here, and we will move on to the next. We will try to move on to the next slide. Okay. Looks like it's hanging up a little bit. Here we go. Okay. So in the 2016 AERA meeting, the Adult Literacy and Adult Education Special Interest Group of researchers talked about bridging what they called a research to practice gap. And in that conversation, the researchers made a number of points that I added to the forum article. And some of those points are that research and practice need to connect. And this connection occurs less than researchers would like to occur. Researchers would like to have more venues to conduct applied research and are very interested in that. And they're also interested in having conversations with practitioners on how to bridge the research-practice divide. So AERA's 2016 SIG leaders for adult literacy and adult education research are interested in restarting those conversations, and by now we're really talking about actually continuing those conversations as well. And so to build on the previous conversations that we've had at professional meetings and on the forum article that I wrote, we come to this afternoon's webinar. And by way of overview, Alisa and I will be talking about why practitioners should care about integrating research and practice. And Alisa will start us off by talking about the need, and then going on from there, she'll talk a little bit about why practitioners don't use research more based on previous work that she's done. From there, we'll both talk about strategies for improving research to practice connections, the 3 topics that I mentioned earlier. And then please stay with us to the end, because we will have a question and answer period. And we also have a question for you related to what's next to building professional communities that are in support of research use and how we can continue the conversation. So I'm going to turn it back over to Alisa for the next slide.
Alisa, we can't hear you. I'm sorry, you're muted.
Thanks for the reminder. I'm sorry. So now I'm all thrown off. So this slide is really perhaps stating the obvious, but I think important, is why should practitioners care about research at all? And really overall, these bullet points point to the fact that research really can serve 2 broad purposes. One is to deepen understanding of a problem, challenge, of the knowledge base. So to go into the research to find something out that you don't know as much about as you would like. And then related to that secondarily is really to try to solve a problem that you're experiencing in your practice. So there's not always research available to solve problems or to speak to your interests, but very often someone else will have done something on that topic or something related to that topic. So research really can be about improving your practice, either by helping you understand a problem better, providing ideas of new practices to try, or you can use research to really affirm or to justify something that you're doing, perhaps to a funder, a supervisor, even to learners. It can be very useful to say, we're doing this because the research tells us that. Okay, so that's why practitioners should care. And to go on to the next slide. Sorry, go back one. Oh, there we go. So further, I'm sorry, there's really two slides on this. It can be very validating to find that other people have been having similar issues and challenges, so that can kind of be morale boosting. It can also then help you connect with other people who have worked on the same issues. It's perfectly wonderful to receive an email from someone saying, I read your article and it was really helpful to me. I'd like to ask you a few questions. So not only does it help you know that other people are experiencing the same things, it can help strengthen your professional network by reaching out to other, to researchers or other practitioners. And again, strengthening funding proposals, replacing anecdotal decision-making really has to do with using the research to justify practice or new innovations. So I think that's probably enough on that slide. So go ahead, Margaret.
Okay, thank you. So back to the Winter 2016 Forum article, I cited two quotations from the AERA meeting participants that I'd like to highlight today that I think boost the points that Alisa was just making. And the first is somebody who said there is not much current empirical research in adult literacy to inform practice, unquote. And you may or may not agree with this statement, but it does point to a need for more research to support practice. And another quote that one of the participants shared was, at the community college where I work, literacy and discipline faculty often do not use the research to inform their practice, nor do they typically conduct research. Again, things may be similar or perhaps different where you work, but this quote points to the general divide between research and practice. So back to you, Alisa.
Okay, so those two quotes really kind of illustrate what the next slide is about, which is findings from research I've done in the literature about why practitioners don't use research more. Those two quotes really suggest that there is a problem, that either practitioners often don't think there is research that's useful, or there's just not a culture for using research where people work. So in the research that I examined, in fact, the findings are that teachers often don't use research unless they're in graduate school or participating in specific professional development settings where use of research is encouraged. Often teachers think that, researchers do research that may not be viewed as purposeful for teachers, because oftentimes researchers are doing research that is judged for quality in the university or in academic journals, and so they aren't quote unquote accountable to teachers, which might really affect the kinds of research that they do and how the opportunities they take to speak to practitioners. And this in turn may even affect the credibility that teachers feel about researchers. So on the one hand, researchers may not be doing the kind of work always that practitioners seek, need, want, or trust, and the next slide will speak to that a little bit. So, and on the other hand, it may be that the culture of where practitioners work does not really encourage the use of research. So more on why teachers critique research. Teachers often see research as lacking in utility, being over theoretical, inconclusive, or too difficult to apply. In one way or another, many teachers think research is not going to be useful. Also, teachers may feel that they don't have the time to seek research or to figure out how to use it. They may not have the opportunities, again, because the culture of where they are doesn't really encourage this. And they may feel they may not have the expertise or the support to access and use research. Back to the researchers. Researchers may not be asking questions that really speak to what practitioners want to know. They may not have the experience in the field. So these slides kind of point out to issues on both sides of the table that kind of impede or create obstacles to practitioners and researchers bridging the divide. So I think it's really important to point out it's not just up to to practitioners to go out and seek research and use it. It's also up to researchers to figure out how to make better connections with practitioners. And that's really a lot about what these conversations at various conferences are about, is to try to bring those two worlds together. But also, we know that in many cases, practitioners do lack some facility with using research. So for the next chunk of this webinar, we're going to talk about trying to address some of those issues. So back to Margaret.
Okay, thank you, Alisa. Our next topic is looking at where to locate research so that you can actually access. And we were supposing here that you might not have access to university or college electronic databases with lots of resources. However, it was very interesting that in our poll, when we did that a good percentage of you do actually have that access. But if you don't, let's start with some places where you could look just on the web and other resources. So for example, we've listed some research journals here that you might consider. So we have the COABE Journal. We have Mountain Plain Adult Education Association has the Journal of Adult Education. And then Adult Education Quarterly is also very well regarded in the field. The asterisk here is indicating that to access those, you would need to have a subscription or go through a library that has a subscription. But again, if you don't have access to a college or a university library, you might even try a local public library, particularly if you're in a fairly large community. There are a couple of journals that are available on the web, such as the Journal of Literacy and Technology. And I've also been able to access the Journal of Lifelong Learning that the Pennsylvania Adult and Continuing Education Association has. And then the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy is another journal that's a good one to look at by subscription. All of those have really good resources in them. In addition, as some of you selected, actually quite a few of you selected in our poll earlier, you can go to your favorite search engine, whatever that is, Google or Bing or Yahoo, whatever you like to use. One of my favorite resources to look for research is actually Google Scholar, and I have the URL here on the screen. And if you plan on joining us for the April 3rd session on research and practice connections, it's called DIY, Do It Yourself, and we hope that you will. We're actually going to be doing some examples of looking at Google Scholar and how to look something up. Okay, another really useful resource for locating research is called ERIC, and a number of you are already very familiar with this. The URL is there. It stands for Education Resources Information Center, and it is sponsored by the Department of Education. And it's a really good set of resources, and especially if you're looking for international resources in research, you can often find them there. And they do have full PDF rights for much of their citations. Not all of them, but many of them definitely. In addition, you can access some research on links at the URL on your screen. And be sure, if you do that, that you specify that you're looking for research. There's a box that you can click that will allow you to do that. And then, of course, if you are connected with a college or a university, you have access to electronic databases, and often they have the PDFs or the articles that you can simply download immediately there. So those might be some very helpful resources. So one of the requests that we got from an adult educator who participated in the 2016 COABE session was really a question: how can we evaluate research? And so Alisa is going to start us off on talking about evaluation.
Thanks. I see that a number of questions, before I get to that, there's a number of people have put in the chat box, will this PowerPoint be made available so that you have a copy of the links? And also, could we provide a bibliography for the articles that we're referring to? Sharon, can you speak to that?
I'd be happy to. Yes, this is being recorded. It will be archived on our website. In addition, it will be when we send out an e-blast tomorrow, which will include your certificate for attending. It will also, the link for the archive will be a part of that e-blast as well. So yes, you will receive a copy of the PowerPoint as well as this recorded webinar.
And we can also add a bibliography to the end of this PowerPoint so that you can have citations for the articles that we've mentioned. Okay, thanks, Sharon. So to move on, we're going to go through, I guess, 4 slides about evaluating research. And at least in the slides I'm going to talk about, when it comes to evaluating, I'm not so much talking about the very scientific idea of evaluating reliability and validity and sort of scientific criteria for is this high quality, but more evaluating the articles in terms of how useful might they be to you? How can you think about whether or not this is something you should pay attention to or not? Okay, so you've located an article through one of those links that Margaret talked about. Now you have it. So what do you do? So on this slide, I'm going to talk about 3 things. First of all, the researcher's background. So some things you can ask yourself is, based on who this researcher is, by the bio they give you, or you might want to Google them, or about how they introduce themselves in the article, you might ask yourself, do they know the field? Have they demonstrated knowledge and expertise about meaningful questions in the field, and how the current context really impacts practice and so forth? So do you believe them? Do they have credibility with you? And related to that, what kinds of biases might they have that might influence how you understand the article? As a qualitative researcher, I always assume a researcher does have a bias. You can never get rid of those. But the ways in which they make that clear through how they frame the study they're going to do, what assumptions they make, these are all important things to ask, because they can help you understand, is this a research finding that would be helpful to me? Could it apply in my site? And asking yourself something about where the researcher comes from might help you decide on that. For the literature review, you should ask yourself, does it reference research that is clearly connected to the study being described? Does the researcher draw connections, and how can you use those connections to deepen your understanding of where this research fits in, how it connects to other things that other researchers have found, and so forth. So also you might look in the literature review to see, are they referencing other research that would be useful to you? So I always tell my grad students, you should always look at the reference list at the end of the article, but start from the literature review and see, are they talking about research that you want to pursue further? So finding one useful research article on a topic that you're interested in can always be very useful in locating others, because of that habit, that necessity that researchers have to connect their research to prior research. And lastly, with regard to the research questions, is this a relevant question to you? Is it significant? Is it informing? Is it clear how this might be useful in practice? If it's not, you might just give it a really quick scan and let it go. But if it is, that's a good sign to move forward. Next slide. Okay, so here we get a little bit more technical, and I will say that, as probably everyone knows, or most of you know, there are two really broad categories of research. One is quantitative, that uses a lot of statistics and a more systematic approach to answering a question, oftentimes with a hypothesis to prove or disprove. And then there's qualitative research, which is really aimed at understanding people's experiences, perceptions, behaviors from the perspective of the participants in the study site. And the criteria for quality are quite different in these two studies. But I would say overall, what you want to ask yourself is, does the way the researcher, did the way the researcher designed the data collection methods seem to be able to answer the questions in ways that are helpful? And then is the sample and the site, the sample being the participants, did the researcher engage the right people to really be able to answer the question? Are the people who are answering the questions informative? Do you know enough about the sample to know whether their responses would be similar or similar types of people that are in your site where you're trying to solve a problem? So the idea is just really to ask yourself, does the research design answer the question in a way that helps you understand in a deeper way? And did the researcher involve the right people and the right kind of contexts to answer that question? And knowing those participants in that context, is this going to be in some way transferable to your context where you're trying to answer your questions? Go ahead, Margaret.
Okay, thank you. So moving on from there, we've differentiated already between quantitative and qualitative studies. And when we're talking about a quantitative paper, one of the questions that you could ask yourself as you're reviewing that research is, do the measures that the author or authors used in the research appear valid for their intended purpose? So they have a purpose in mind for doing the study and writing it up. And does it look to you like whatever measures they're using, whether it's a test or an inventory of some type, or even just the data that they're collecting, does it look like it's actually going to get at the intended purpose? That's important to understand. With a qualitative approach, another question to ask is, was there enough intensity of data collection for the results to be useful? So were the data collected in such a way also that the researcher could ensure that the participants' perspectives were reflected adequately? So if the participants had information to share, is it pretty clear that their perspectives, that them being the participants in the study, were actually reflected? That's important to know as well. Back on the quantitative side, if the researcher writing the paper use statistical techniques, and typically they do, did they use those techniques appropriately, and did they use them correctly as best as you can tell? And a little bit later we're going to be talking about maybe looking at research in group settings, because there's probably some of you who have a lot more expertise in statistics and research itself that could share that with peers and would be able to help identify if those statistics have been used as accurately as possible. And then on the qualitative side, did the researcher include what we would call a thick description of how participants responded if they were interviewed, or how they behaved if they were observed. So was the description thorough and rich enough that you can really get a sense of what was going on? And then our last slide on evaluation, we're looking at conclusions and results, and what does that mean for you? So the researcher typically will discuss the results and reach some conclusions, and then the question becomes, when the researcher discusses those results, do they appear to support the researcher's conclusions about them? And you would think that that might be a no-brainer, but it is easy as a researcher to sometimes make recommendations or draw conclusions that the results may not really bear out. And so you, as the consumer of the research, can say to yourself, well, it looks like they did a really great analysis here, and I get the results, but I'm not quite so sure that the way they're discussing it or what they're drawing from it is all of that helpful to me. If you're looking at a qualitative report, you can ask, did the report present specific hypotheses or questions that emerged, that kind of bubbled up from the data that were collected? And then our last set here is looking at generalizability and implications for practice. So in the case of a quantitative study, usually we're saying that the researcher has selected a sample and believes that that sample will ultimately generalize to a certain population. So we might select a sample of adult learners and say that that generalizes to a certain subpopulation within adult education overall. And so the researcher's task then is to say, all right, we've done our sample, here are our results, this is how this sample generalizes to the adult education population. If we're looking at a qualitative study, and now we're not so much concerned about samples and the number of people that we have as we are about what happened to those participants, those adult learners in our example qualitatively, but do those results now generalize to an appropriate group that's under study, whether that's a certain type of adult learner or whatever it is that particular researcher has identified. And then last but definitely not least for evaluation, did the researcher draw reasonable and actionable implications for practice from the results? So you as the practitioner are saying, okay, we've got the findings, we've got the discussion and conclusions, but what can I get out of this that is reasonable for me to implement in my practice and something that I can actually act on? In addition to that, we have some further recommendations for evaluation in the Winter 2016 Forum article that I would encourage you to look at. And so to the extent that you can answer these questions either on your own or with others, the easier it will be to evaluate the report, book, chapter, or article for your use in practice. So I'm going to hand it back over to Alisa, and we'll go on to our next topic.
Okay, so we've talked about locating research, we've talked about evaluating research, and now we're going to be talking about using research. And just as sort of a segue from evaluating research, I would say that one thing to keep in mind is that just because it's published doesn't necessarily mean it's always the best, reliable, that you can, well, it kind of goes to the you can't believe everything you read. On the other hand, when you read research, even though you may be able to question or critique or not be sure about everything in there, I think one of the most important things to think about is how does what I'm reading relate to my practice and how might I use it? Even if it can't be just automatically kind of picked up and from the journal article and plopped into your practice, but rather how does it stimulate you to think about an issue or a challenge that you're experiencing in a different way? How does it encourage you to explore new options for practice as a result of things you've read about. Because really most things are not 100% generalizable anyway. And as a practitioner, really what you want to try to do is think, what might help in my classroom? And then just try it out and see. So really an important contribution that research can make to your practice is to stimulate your thinking, to give you new ideas, and to help encourage you to try new things to address challenges or issues that you're facing in your classroom. And to that, our next couple of slides are about application of research, so how to make it useful. And really not to read, I think you skipped one, Margaret, can you back up one? Not to read these bullet points to you, but the big overall point of the slide is to make sure that as you read research, you're engaging in this activity of making it your own by reflecting on what you're reading about and by talking about research you're reading with others. So that idea of advocate for, lead, and or participate in study circles and so forth is really about organizing opportunities or participating in opportunities to interact with colleagues about research. That's really what's going to help you move from just reading about something, maybe passing it by, maybe saying, I don't really understand this or whatever. It's going to go from, maybe if I talk to other people about this, we'll start to get some ideas of how is this useful and applicable to us. Next slide, please. So I think just to kind of carry on with that idea, the way to act on research findings is to use the research to impel you to experiment a little bit with your practice, to experiment with new ideas and innovations, to try it out, to see what happens when you try it out, to pay attention to what changes or doesn't change when you try it out, and then to adjust and respond from there. It may be that because you've tried something out from the research, and you really, if you engage in sort of systematically trying it, talking to other people, looking at what happens, who knows, you might be the next one to put some research out there for others. For example, in the COAIB journal, we have a section on practitioners, or that we want practitioners to contribute to about new innovations in their practice. This would be a great place to contribute to the knowledge base in practice, from practice for practitioners in the COAIB journal. Next slide.
Okay. So say, for example, to continue this idea of how we're using research, say, for example, that you read something in a research article and you wanted to investigate how it might work in your program. That's great. And you might need a little bit of funding for that. And one of the very interesting suggestions here was asking your program administrator for it. And my first reaction to that was like, oh, well, I don't know if my program administrator would have the funding. But then I thought about it a little bit more and I thought, well, the end of the year is coming up and sometimes there's those few pennies that might be able to be scraped together to support that. Or you could look at a small grant for research. So maybe with a little creativity, you could ask for it and you could get it. In addition to that, you might have an item for a research agenda within your state, or a research question that you'd like to submit to your local or state administrator. I think that's a great idea too. And the last recommendation from Smith and colleagues would be to conduct research on your own. And then, as Alisa just mentioned, share the findings locally or at one of your state conferences or through COAIB. I think any of those would be great possibilities to consider. Okay. So going back to the AERA meeting conversation in 2016, to wrap up the ways that we could use research, I just wanted to point out that participants in that conversation had a few suggestions also. So one of the things that they suggested was practitioners and researchers working together on applied research. Partnerships could be developed with university or college researchers to create maybe a laboratory for research. That was an interesting idea. Another thought is creating a professional learning communities around research, either locally or on a very broad level. We could consider that, definitely. And then they suggested fostering a culture of professional learning that would emphasize research or theory. So those are all viable ideas as well. So we're going on next to your questions, and it looks like a lot of different questions have popped up in the chat box as we've been talking. We've shared quite a bit of information with you this afternoon, obviously, and we have a question for you in just a moment, but we'd really like to hear your questions or concerns next. So to do that, let's take a look at the chat feature. And Alisa, unfortunately, with the screen up, I'm not sure that I can read that chat, but I'm going to try. Maybe I can.
So far, there are not questions that are new. Oh, I see one. One of the questions I sometimes am asked is, who is funding adult basic skills research now? That's a great question. There's not a lot of national funding, but one thing to do, especially if you're a practitioner, is to hit up some of your local funding sources around pursuing a very specific research agenda within your program. So for example, if you wanted to get a little extra money to support a practitioner action research group, or that kind of, we want to try something out in our program and document it, that might be a really excellent source to ask a local funder to say, hey, we want to do the best job with your money that you're already giving us that we can. Would you give us a little extra, or can we use some of our money that you are already giving us to understand how we might be able to improve our practice by using research to innovate? So that might be one source. I'm afraid I don't have a great answer to that. There are a few national sources that are very large scale, like the Institute for Educational Science, but that's kind of out of reach for most people. I think foundations, local sources are probably the best bet for the kind of action research that we're talking about. The next question was, one participant says they're using Dr. Coleman's emotional intelligence programs. I think that's an example of using research in their program. So congratulations on already informing your practice with research. Are there any online discussion forums sharing research in adult education? Margaret, do you have a good answer for that?
The only online discussion that I've been involved in actually has been through links. Periodically, there will be a links discussion that's occurring on a particular topic. For example, I had helped to moderate a discussion on adults with disabilities several months back, and periodically, you know, research efforts related to PIOC and other research topics have popped up on links. But that is definitely one of the questions we'd like to explore is how could we continue the discussion going and making sure that people can chime in on sharing research and conducting research, for that matter. I think it goes both ways. Looks like David has a question, David Rosen also. Have there been recent studies on what adult basic skills teachers' questions are that can be addressed by research? If so, have the results been widely shared with researchers, for example, at AERA? I'm not sure if this question is addressing teachers' professional development issues. but I would say not as much as there had been, say, even 5-10 years ago. But those topics do pop up periodically at AERA for researchers to discuss. And I think it would be great to share that with the field more broadly. I know that in the same issue, and this was actually cited when we were talking about what we could do, from Chris Smith in the issue where I wrote the forum piece. She had a follow-up article also, and Chris Smith has written extensively on professional development for staff in both in the COABE journal and through other formats. So that might be a good spot to start. As Alisa told us earlier, look at the Lit Review, because there's lots of good resources in there that you could go ahead and look up.
So if I could just piggyback on that slightly. First of all, David also posted two links, because as you said, Margaret, Links does periodically sponsor panel discussions, very much like this webinar, but focusing on recent research that comes out. But I would also say, in answer to David's question, that probably the researchers in the field have not either taken or had enough opportunity to ask what research would be useful to practitioners at this point. And I do think that that question very much speaks to the research to practice conversation that we're trying to ignite and perpetuate through these various venues, that not only do practitioners, we want to encourage practitioners to use research more. We also want to encourage researchers to do research that is useful to practitioners. And so I think that that's actually sort of a question in the form of a great recommendation. And that is kind of a wonderful segue to our second to last slide, which is a question that we'd like for you all to answer in the chat box if possible. And this will get saved so that you're not just spitting into the chat box and then it goes away. Our very last question is really, as we said, a follow-up to the next steps in trying to bridge the research to practice gap, which is how can researchers and practitioners partner together to make research and practice connections? So I'm going to take David's question as sort of like a first answer to that question, which is knowing more about what practitioners actually want to know about, want research about, and invite the rest of you to chat in. And as you do that, I'm going to turn it over to Sharon, who will reintroduce our guest, Michael.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Alisa and Margaret, for the excellent presentation. And now I would like to turn this over to Michael Ormsby of Essential Education. Michael?
Hi. Let me get my slides up. Okay. Thanks. Great presentation. In the theme of research to practice, can you all hear me? Okay. Sure.
We sure can.
Okay. Just check. In the theme of research to practice, I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about how we at Essential Education have used research done by the educational psychologist Benjamin Bloom to improve learning outcomes of adult learners. Benjamin Bloom is probably most known for his work on Bloom's taxonomy, which I'm sure you know is a classification system used to define different levels of human cognition. But one of the most interesting contributions is his work on what he called mastery learning. This research spanned, at least 3 decades, and I think it's been implemented into thousands of classrooms. It's really easy to find the research online. What we've done at our company is to use this research on mastery learning to build a much more effective computer-based learning experience for adult learners. So adult learners come to us with a whole range of teaching challenges, as you know. One challenge is that they have gaps in their knowledge and skills. They may be proficient in one area, but really can't move ahead because they're missing a foundational skill. Another challenge is that adult learners learn at different speeds and with different modalities. And of course, there's the challenge of motivating adult learners. So very often, a one-size-fits-all curriculum leaves a lot of learners behind. So it would seem to me that a core problem to solve in the adult ed classroom is how to personalize or differentiate the learning experience. This is where Bloom's work on mastery learning can really help. So the question is, what is mastery learning? Bloom asked a simple question. Why can't all learners be successful? Why does there always have to be a bell curve? Why does student performance have to be divided into 3 levels? Why can't everyone or most people learn the material? What Bloom and his researchers did was in their research, is to create 3 types of classroom learning situations. Okay, so the first one is a conventional classroom. The second one is where it's just a one-on-one kind of personal tutoring experience for the student. And then the third is where these 2 elements are blended together, where the elements of the traditional classroom are blended with the one-on-one tutoring in what he called mastery learning. Okay, so what did he find? And this is the really interesting part. Again, this has been done in hundreds of studies. You can see them on the internet. A few of the studies have been in adult education, mostly in K-12, but it's really about how people learn. The most interesting thing about this is that they found is that learning is not dependent on aptitude. In other words, most learners can learn most things if 2 conditions are met. One of those conditions is time. If the learner is given enough time, they can generally learn. The second condition has to do with how the material is presented or explained to the learner. So often just handing a learner a workbook or software that relies heavily on text to teach leaves a lot of learners behind. Okay, so what does this have to do, or how can this research be implemented into the classroom, and what is exactly meant by mastery learning as a way of teaching? And I'm not going to go through the very details of the research. You can do that and all, but what we've done is gleaned 5 principles that occur over and over and again in the research. And we're going to talk about those principles of mastery learning. Okay, so the first one is first to identify the skill gaps. So what we're talking about here are now principles of mastery learning, and then we'll talk about how these can be applied in the classroom. So first of all, identify the gaps. There needs to be an accurate assessment tool that identifies the gaps in the student's understanding. And then with that data, the instruction focuses on prerequisites and foundational skills first before moving the student on to more difficult material. The second principle is to chunk the learning so that learners are not overwhelmed by the amount of material they have to learn. Instruction is divided into small, manageable pieces that they can accomplish in just a couple weeks. The third is to instruct for high engagement. And this addresses the issues of motivation and how material is presented to the learner. So just handing a learner a workbook or asking them to use software that's primarily text-based, as I said, leaves learners behind. And the reason is that it's often not meaningful or relevant to them. They can't connect, they have difficulty connecting and engaging because it's not interesting or connecting cognitively or emotionally to them. Okay, the fourth is to use what is often referred to as SMART assessments. It's critical to know what the learner is getting and not getting from the instruction. So mastery learning uses a continuing cycle of formative assessments to identify the missing elements in the student's understanding. And then the fifth piece is to use corrective instruction to reteach the concepts that are identified in those SMART assessments. So what mastery learning is, just to kind of bring it all together, is it's a repeating cycle of teaching, assessing, reteaching, assessing, and reteaching until the learner has mastered the material. And to make sure that the learner has mastered the basics before they move on to more complex. Okay, So the question is then, how can we implement these 5 mastery learning principles into the adult ed classroom? And that's where a new type of learning software can really help and come to the rescue. It's called adaptive learning software. And it uses built-in formative assessments and high engagement instruction to build a personalized learning plan that is continually adapted to what the learner needs. It's basically putting that experience of a personal tutor into the software by using the data that the student is actually creating. Okay, so this is what we've done at Essential Education in our software. It's been really hard to, when you step back and look at, so why isn't mastery learning used more? And the reason is that it's hard to do it because of that process. In other words, it's hard to get all that data and adapt to it quickly. So that's where software has really helped. Essential Education, this is what we do, what we brought to adult education. And it's built on these 5, our software is built on these 5 principles, and it's why we generally see faster learning. So that's a quick overview of kind of how research is, we've used research. If you want to learn more about this, you can contact me personally. Here's my email address. We're doing a session at COABE on mastery learning on Tuesday, April 4th. Dan Griffiths will do that. We put together a guide that helps you understand more of the mastery learning. As I said, you can go online and get a lot of information about it. You can just use this link to get that guide. And that's about all I have to say. Appreciate your time and be interested to know what you all think.
Wonderful. Michael, thank you so much. We really appreciate that summary, and we appreciate all the support you've provided in terms of research. As I mentioned in the beginning, our Research to Practice initiative has been extremely successful, and that's been thanks to Essential Education for their funding for that. So now I'd like to turn this back to Margaret Patterson and Alisa Belzer just to say a few final words before we sign off.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Michael. We would like to say, just please, if you're going to be at COABE, come to our session. It'll be Monday, 3:15, April 3rd. We'll be actually doing a very hands-on and experiential session on using research. But also we'd like to invite you to continue to put your responses to our question in the chat box, which is how can researchers and practitioners partner together, and invite you to read the chats because a number of people have already contributed resources and ideas that would be that are wonderful. Here's our contact information, and one last thing that I forgot to say about the Orlando session, which is that Cheryl Keenan, the Director of the Division of Adult Education and Literacy from Octave, will be joining us at that session. We know that Octave cares a lot about research use and also building better connections, and they're showing that by participating in the session. And with that, I will say thank you so much again to Sharon for inviting Margaret and me to do this session. And we look forward to seeing you in Orlando.
Thank you, everyone. It was great talking with you. And thank you, Sharon and Michael.
Our pleasure. Thank you, ladies, and thank you, Michael. And we hope to see everybody at COABE in Orlando in just a few weeks now. Bye now.
2 weeks, yeah.
2 weeks, I know.
Yikes.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.